impact of Reconstruction. Lecture terms. Radical Reconstruction in the South. Focus question. What were the social and political effects of radical Reconstruction in the South? Radical Reconstruction in the South. The Reconstruction Act sparked great political activity among former slaves in the South, who held mass meetings, went on strike, and tried to desegregate public transportation. Thousands of Southern blacks joined the Union League, an organization tied to the Republican Party, and the vast majority of eligible black voters registered to vote. In the words of one former slave turned political leader, blacks had heard, quote, the tocsin of freedom. By 1870, all former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union, and most were under Republican control. Their new state constitutions, drafted in 1868 and 1869, in conventions that had substantial black representation, were an improvement over the old state constitutions. They created state-funded systems of free public education, penitentiaries, and orphan and insane asylums where none existed before. They guaranteed equality of civil and political rights and abolished antebellum practices such as whipping as a criminal punishment, property qualifications for office holding, and imprisonment for debt. Though blacks were the majority of Republican voters, white Republicans controlled the state Republican parties and held most political offices. Only South Carolina, with a high percentage of blacks in the population, had a majority black legislature. But the 2,000 African Americans who held public office in Reconstruction represented a radical shift of power in the South. 2 blacks were elected to the U.S. Senate. 14 were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and 1 served as the first black governor in Louisiana. Many blacks served in state legislatures, and more blacks than ever before held lower offices such as sheriff, tax assessor, and policeman. Most of these black office holders were former slaves. The South's new state governments also empowered new groups of whites. Some were Northerners who migrated to the South after the war. Opponents called them carpetbaggers, implying that they packed their possessions in a suitcase to quickly move to the South and gain the spoils of office. While a few were corrupt, most carpetbaggers were Union Army veterans who decided to stay in the South after the war. Others were investors in land and railroads seeking economic opportunity. Yet others were teachers, Freedmen's Bureau officers, and others who traveled to the South to help former slaves. Most white Republicans, however, were from the South and were despised by former Confederates, who saw them as treasonous scalawags. While a few were wealthy whites, most were non-slave-holding, small white farmers from the southern upcountry. Many had been Unionists during the war, or hoped Reconstruction governments would pass laws favoring indebted farmers. The Reconstruction government's greatest accomplishment was establishing state-supported public schools that served both black and white children, although usually in segregated schools. They also passed civil rights laws that made it illegal for railroads, hotels, and other institutions to discriminate by race. Some states also strengthened the economic power of rural blacks by passing laws favoring agricultural workers and sharecroppers. But Reconstruction governments did not try to promote economic prosperity through land distribution, as many blacks had once hoped, but rather tried by developing railroads, which they hoped would spur industrialization, urbanization, and diversified agriculture. Every southern state tried to finance railroad construction and attract industry through tax and subsidy policies, but a revitalized southern economy failed to take shape. Nevertheless, radical Reconstruction transformed the South by empowering poor whites, northern migrants, and former slaves. The overthrow of Reconstruction. Focus question. What were the main factors in both the North and the South for the abandonment of Reconstruction? Reconstruction's opponents. Corruption did exist during Reconstruction, but it was not confined to a race, region, or party. Opponents of Reconstruction could not accept the idea of former slaves voting, holding office, and enjoying equality before the law. And this led to more opposition and violence after 1868. A reign of terror will happen in southern states. Republican presence in the South led to more organized opposition and violence by 1868. Secret societies sprang up in the South with the aim of preventing blacks from voting and destroying the organization of the Republican Party. The most infamous of these secret societies was the Ku Klux Klan that was organized in 1866. It launched what one victim called a reign of terror against Republican leaders, black and white. There were many hangings of innocent people, including those in Colfax, Louisiana. A massacre happened there in 1873. Congress and President Grant, with the passage of 3 enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871, put an end to the Ku Klux Klan by 1872. However, the KKK would continue to meet in secret, even though it was against the law, for many, many years to come. Northern commitment to Reconstruction declined in the 1870s. Radicals such as Thaddeus Stevens passed away or otherwise left politics, and they were replaced by figures less dedicated to equal rights for blacks. Northerners more and more felt the South should solve its own problems without continuous federal involvement. Many in the North believed that now that the national government had freed the slaves, made them citizens, and given them the vote, blacks had to depend on themselves. In 1872, an influential group of Republicans, angered by corruption in the Grant administration, and believing that federal power needed to be reduced, formed their own party, calling themselves the Liberal Republicans. They nominated Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, for president. They repeated Democratic criticisms of radical Reconstruction as encouraging corruption and preventing the rule of the, quote, best men in the South. That region's, quote, natural leaders, they argued. Democratic leaders embraced the Republican split and ultimately endorsed Greeley. But many rank-and-file Democrats could not stomach Greeley, a former Whig and Republican, and Grant eventually won a second term to the presidency by a great margin. Nonetheless, liberal Republicans and Democrats in the North could now agree on rolling back Reconstruction. Northern critics stepped up their openly racist attacks on Southern governments as dens of corruption and misgovernment ruined by black rule. A severe depression beginning in 1873 also distracted Northern Republicans from Southern issues. Democrats were widely successful in the 1874 elections and took control of the House of Representatives as a result. But before this new Congress met, legislators passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which barred racial discrimination in public accommodations, such as hotels and theaters. The Supreme Court also signaled a retreat from Reconstruction in the slaughterhouse cases of 1873, in which it held that the federal government could not effectively protect the legal and civil rights of individuals in the states. Effectively, this would mitigate the 14th Amendment completely and give it over to the states to determine what was right. As the Supreme Court whittled away at Congress's guarantees of black rights with these famous slaughterhouse cases, and others. We see the overthrow of Reconstruction becoming a reality. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction was under serious assault. Democrats had regained control of states with large white voting majorities, such as Tennessee, North Carolina, and Texas, and called themselves, quote, redeemers, for having redeemed the white South from corruption, misgovernment, and Northern and black control. Violence flared in states where Reconstruction governments persisted, and the Grant administration now refrained from protecting besieged governments and Republicans. In 1875 and 1876, armed Democrats on Election Day simply destroyed ballots and drove blacks away from the polls, capturing states such as Mississippi and South Carolina. Events in South Carolina directly shaped the outcome of the 1876 presidential elections. Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who ran against the Democrats, Samuel J. Tilden, New York's governor. By 1876, only South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana were still controlled by Republicans, and the election was so close that whoever carried these states, which both parties claimed to have won, would become president. Congress tried to resolve this impasse by appointing an electoral commission, which, with a Republican majority, decided that Hayes had carried the critical southern states and been elected. But to secure this result, behind-the-scenes Republicans negotiated with Democrats, agreeing to recognize Democratic control of the South and refrain from future federal interference in Southern affairs. Democrats in the South promised to respect black rights and not dispute Hayes' right to office in exchange. This became known as the Bargain of 1877. Hayes quickly ordered federal troops to stand down, which allowed Democrats in Louisiana and South Carolina to occupy the state governments there. The end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, defined as America's adjustment to the end of slavery, continued long after 1877. Blacks still voted and in some states held office well into the 1890s. But a distinct period in which Republicans controlled much of the South and blacks held some political power, and the federal government protected the basic rights of all American citizens, came to an end in 1877. Only a century later, in the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, would the federal government finally act to secure the rights of all, regardless of race.